Hello, everybody. I'm very delighted to have, as an invited person, a doctor, a real doctor, which I have a huge respect. Not because he's a doctor, we will go why I have also some respect on this, but it's also that he's very common, has a very common background with where I was myself as a Christian when I was earlier in my life. Even today, I'm not a Christian. I will not debate why I'm not a Christian with him, excluding if the discussion goes there. But the point is that we have this kind of view, especially in evangelical churches, but also in Romanian, because this is also to a Romanian audience. Some of the believers think that if you deny, for example, a historical view of the creation of the world, for example, you definitely are not a Christian. And other questions are, for example, is it a doubt there is an evolution doubt, like people are just troubled about the holes in evolution? I don't know how he said, but first of all, I want to say that Dr. Joshua Swamidass, I think he knows one or two things about evolution. And would you say, is it true?
Yeah, I mean, of course, it all depends what you mean by it, but I think most people mean, change over time such that humans share common ancestry with the great apes. And yeah, it really does seem to be true.
Are you a Christian?
Yeah, I'm a Christian too. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
I believe that Jesus rose from the dead, and that's how he makes himself known to the world.
I have a curiosity. As far as I read, and people can search about yourself, you are a doctor in, I think, computational biology, if I read correctly. Maybe I'm...
So I have a medical doctorate, so I'm a physician, and I also have a PhD in computer science and computational biology. So
awesome. I wrote one scientific paper out of my free time, and it was in computational biology.
Oh, cool. Yeah. So I'm both types of doctor. I'm a physician and a scientist.
Right. So don't you think that there are many doctors that creationists have? Don't you think it's a balanced talk? Like, let's say you heard about Kent Hovind. I remember, I don't know all the others, but there are many. As for myself, I see them as phony doctors. But do you think that creationists in general or intelligent design have doctors that...
well, so you mentioned Kent Hovind. Kent Hovind is not a doctor by any professional standard that I know of. But there are other creationists and intelligent design, people who are actually doctors and even sometimes accomplished scientists. Now, that's pretty rare. It's kind of like a little bit like they're very much zebras, but they do exist. And I think there's actually some value in engaging those more thoughtful and informed sorts of creationists and intelligent design advocates over some of the people who get more attention, like Kent Hovind, in my opinion. So I've enjoyed, for example, talking to Marcus Ross recently. I just did a debate with him. He's actually a paleontologist. I sat through a lecture he gave on, mosasaurs and the paleontology of mosasaurs. It was fascinating. He knows what he's talking about. And I think he's wrong about a lot of things. I don't think he's handling all the data, but he is far more informed and much more of an interesting conversation partner than you would get from someone much less informed.
That's awesome. I want to say one curiosity, maybe you did observe it or not, is that you heard this, for example, debate evolution. Many atheists are branded like evolutionists or evil-ionists, and the other parts are the Christians, and more or less is creationists on the other side. And there is this association, but the observation which I have, so let's talk about, for example, Darwin. Everyone, I praise, I have the book, Origin of Species, but this is not important to say the book. He is known as he's an atheist, right? I mean, no matter if you think, okay. But as far as I noticed, the strongest arguments for evolution are made by Christians. No joke here. So if you heard about, for example, how do we know that we share common apes? So one Ken Miller, he made this argument with a scientific paper that the gene, I'm not a biologist, chromosome 2 and 19, they are fused together, something like that. And we know the fusion point. This clip, if you look online, is by Ken Miller. If you look how do we know that we get a common ancestor with apes? The biggest project proving this is by Francis Collins, who got even a prize.
Well,
so I'm saying
he didn't get a Nobel. I don't think he got a Nobel Prize. I mean, it was just the sequencing the gene. Okay, but yeah, so yes, there are Christians involved in this. I think the key point is that it's not just an atheistic argument. Even early on, like in the United States, there was a botanist named Asa Gray, who was a Christian who was a key part of making evolution known here in the United States in the 1800s. And, you know, honestly, most Christians didn't have a problem with evolution, except when it came to the evolution of humans. That's where there was a lot of big questions that arose. So even like in the Scopes trial, you know, where the movie Inherit the Wind was, it was like in you know, the early 1900s, there was a trial about teaching you know, evolution in the public school system here in the United States. I mean, I don't know how it exactly works in Romania, but that's a pretty big deal here. And it was a big show trial. It was kind of like a circus. And the lead lawyer, you know, arguing against evolution was William Jennings Bryan. And William Jennings Bryan, you know, thought the Earth was old, had no problem with evolution in the animal and plant kingdom. The real big question, the big real fight was about human evolution. And whether or not we share, you know, ancestry of the great apes. And that's always where the difficulty has been. And that shouldn't be a surprise. You know, there's even non-religious people that have doubts about evolution because it just seems unbelievable that there's a connection between us and other animals. Because from, you know, one frame of view, we're quite different. Even though from other frames of view, we were quite the same.
Right. All right. So the discussion, more or less, I won't say that many people don't even know they are, let's say, parroting Christian arguments for evolution, even they are atheist, and the other parts which they say this is an atheist argument most of the time.
But a lot of these arguments, okay, wait, so you can't really categorize these arguments as atheist or I mean, there are atheistic arguments.
There is this category which
and there are atheistic arguments and there are Christian arguments, right? But when we're talking about scientific evidence, you can't really partition them out that way. We're just making statements about evidence.
I agree. One part which I think, I don't know the US, the right split, but I think at least kind of 55% of scientists are Christians in US or theists. Just to say, there was that poll.
Yeah, but that's not necessarily helpful for the problem, because that's,
I think,
if you go back 100 years ago, there was a group of religious people that had no problem with evolution, right?
Yes, but I won't say other things. So the other argument. So let's take this 55%.
Okay.
So if you Google, let's say, you know, there is this Google Scholar or PubMed, reasonably around the same percent would publish. And if you see the published papers of something with evolution, you get into 5-6 million papers. 8, depending on the words, you understand. So if you get genetic drift, you'll get maybe 500,000 pages or something like that. But when you look intelligent design, creationist paper, you'll see most of the papers are indoctrination in schools. But let's discard this. All arguments which intelligent design propose are, I think, 100 papers per year at most.
Well, I mean, yeah, but that's not how science is really decided, though.
I agree, but I'm saying that there is clearly the Christians, 99.9 papers they publish, they are in evolution camp. That's I want to say, Christians or not.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that. Look, I would say that that the vast majority of scientists see no reason to question or dispute, you know, the core findings of evolutionary science. There's dispute about the margins and the mechanism at different times, and actually, intelligent design has been welcome to participate in that debate. And you know, at times, you know, their ideas have been really engaged really carefully and closely. And there's some interesting things that have come out, but they haven't come anywhere close to showing somehow that, you know, God's tinkering was required. Now, that doesn't mean God didn't actually tinker. Maybe he did. I mean, science has a hard time answering that question. But it also means that they don't really have that sort of strong evidence. Now in their defense, and I'm no ID advocate, in their defense, I think that when part of the reason why I think they have been arguing for positive evidence for design is because a lot of atheists have argued that that somehow if evolution's true, that means that God wasn't involved, and that's not true either. Really, that's just not true either. And so
Yes.
that's an overstatement in the other direction. And so the reality is that science is neutral. It doesn't really adjudicate a lot of these questions about God that we want it to. We come to it with our questions, but science doesn't always work in that way. It doesn't always care about our questions.
Right. So also we will go also to intelligent design. I want still a bit to talk about creationists, but I promise we'll go to intelligent design right away. So one part which I think also the creationists have an issue is that part of the creationists is that they start like really all the Bible is kind of a literal piece of knowledge which fall from heaven, more or less. It was, let's say, inspired or breathed in, and this makes the Bible. And I think I would not strictly want to use this word fundamentalist, but I think this is also a part that it develops also partially what Christianity was about. So my understanding is that if you read any theologian, and I was, or like in a liberal school of thought. Have you heard about Shelby Spong, John Shelby Spong?
No, not exactly.
Doesn't matter. He's a, let's say, liberal, and these are demonized theologians. But many theologians, and even they are quoting the older theologians, they will notice that Christianity would interpret every time with multiple layers the Bible text, like the Jews would do it.
Okay.
And my thinking is that creationists fail on both ends. Like they have to misrepresent science at one end, and also they drop all what we know about the Christian thought.
Yeah, I do think that was a big thing for me to understand. Now, the way I put it is, I actually think that God also. I mean, I agree with him that God inspired Scripture. I think that it's important that it teaches things. I think it's inerrant and infallible in all that it teaches. I have pretty conservative Christian views on that. It's just that doesn't mean that we should settle for a naive and rigid reading of an English translation by someone. I mean, that actually is in conflict with what the text actually says. I mean, so much of what creationists take as rigid and certain. When I looked at it closely, I found out that, hey, wait a minute, this isn't even what Genesis says, and at times it even seemed to be in contradiction with what Genesis said. And so yeah, I mean, I do think it does fail on both ends.
Right. So let's go on the other side, and I will return back to Genesis. So let's go to intelligent design, which I didn't want to avoid, but it switched a bit at all. So intelligent design is where I met you, technically speaking. So I met you there is a very known UK show named Unbelievable, which is a very good show, I would say. So if you're a Christian, you should see it. If you are
I've been on the show a couple of times, right?
Yes. So
that's how you saw me.
Yes. So I saw you especially in the talk with Bihi.
Yeah.
And I will not comment too much about Bihi. I don't want to be an attack on his character. That's not my point. I noticed you made one very good argument about complexity. So how do you understand the thesis of intelligent design? And you made this amoeba case, the amoeba getting, if I remember right, a bacteria, which becomes an organelle. And you should please explain also for some of the public what means an organelle. I mean, I understand, but maybe...
Yeah, so, cells are really complicated. And frankly, it just takes whether you just know a little bit about it or a lot about it, it should be surprising that something like that could evolve. Now, in context, it's not clear you have to evolve any new cells between like a chimpanzee and a human. So this is very far away from where the big debate has been. So I'm not really sure what the theological trouble is. But we should be a little bit surprised that something like that could arise, right? And maybe God had to be involved. And there's a lot of complexity in it. And it has a lot of parts that are doing things that it doesn't seem clear where it came from. And a group of things like that are things called organelles, which are like distinct pieces, kind of like organs in a human. They're called organelles in a cell.
Mitochondria.
What?
Like mitochondria, if I
like
remember.
mitochondria and chloroplasts and things like that. And there's chloroplasts in plants, obviously, right? And mitochondria are in us. And you know, it just raises questions of how did that get there? And it seemed really insurmountable and impossible at first. But when you look at it more closely, people said, hey, maybe it's not as impossible as we thought. Maybe this is what happened. And so one of the big theories that was out there for some organelles like chloroplasts and mitochondria is to say, hey, maybe that what happened is two cells merged in the past, and like one swallowed the other, and that other one then became like this specialized mitochondria or chloroplast, which okay, that seems to make it less of a leap. And it took some creativity to figure it out. And we can start looking for evidence about whether or not that's the case. And there is some evidence for that, but we didn't actually see it. Now, what's interesting, though, is that you can actually, and this happened, there were some really amazing and interesting experiments where you can actually observe it in human timescales. Something very similar to this happening, where an amoeba will take and eat a bacteria or an algae, and some of them won't get eaten. And then they'll start to evolve like a symbiotic relationship. So essentially functioning like like an organelle, to the point where both of them become dependent on each other and can't live without each other, and are, you know, more complex than they were. The aggregate entity is more complex than the individuals were before, and that's really fascinating. So it ends up being experimental validation that that's really possible. I mean, if it can be done on human time scales, it can certainly be done on the time scales of life on Earth, for sure.
Mm-hmm. And it had also the advantages like both the organelle and the host would be better off together.
Yeah, so the specialization ends up helping it. Mm-hmm. So, for example, if that swallowed bacteria, which becomes an organelle soon, is really better at, you know, metabolizing some sort of food or a toxin than the main host, and the main host can kind of let go of all its ways of managing that before and just start relying on the organelle better. And the organelle can start throwing away all of what it needed to do everything else. And you might say, oh, wait a minute, they're just evolving. They're losing abilities. And that's true. And that's what's interesting about it, is like the complexity increases because they're actually losing their functions on individual parts, because that's what specialization is. Specialization is where different parts, you know, lose ability to do certain things and become dependent on one another. And so, you know, it ends up being the exact mechanisms that they're very comfortable with. I mean, you know, most ID people are very comfortable with the idea of cells losing ability to do things, but that's all you really need to see an increase in complexity.
I agree. So also there was, when you were talking about this argument, it was saying basically that complexity is hard to define it on the edges, and you can't do this irreducibly complex issue. And the other part, which you were talking especially about heat, but I want to say that this argument, I heard it not only about patients, but the wording itself. And maybe this is clear in Romanian. I hope it's the same in English. So one part which kind of evolution says, so I'm not talking about Darwin's one. Darwin one was kind of gradualism. My understanding of today's evolution is that you have two engines pushing the evolution. One is plasticity. So the environment makes it sure that the animals or plants are adapted to the special environment they are living. And the other one is genetic drift. And these two together, they go kind of accelerating and then kind of stagnating, then accelerating. This is my understanding of today's evolution. Okay, but what I want to talk about, I notice very often that when it is exposed, let's say how evolution fails, it uses this kind of language, which I would say is Lamarckianism. And how it sounds, it says a dog jumps in water and swims, and it adapts to become a swimmer, and it becomes a dolphin. But this kind of, it shows kind of a desire of the dog to become a dolphin in future, or whatever it's the animal. I think this wording, I think it made it very hard in both sides on the discussion that you are saying that evolution is not necessarily guided or unguided by God. This science can't decide. You understand? But the part that you said, how could a dog decide tomorrow to become a fox? And this is really what the stereotype you hear. How can, I don't know, a crocodile wakes up and becomes a duck or crocodile or whatever. I think this impreciseness, I think, is a fault in which discredit in a way the scientific discussion, the discourse. When you are talking, again, I was using the discourse with Behe for now. You are saying, look, Behe, you are criticize always the Darwin, what he said. Yeah. But you are not criticizing what evolution says today. Of course, gradualism is false. You said it on live. And I think, in my understanding as a amateur fan of science person, I would agree with you. You understand, but this is what the science says. So I think there is this gap, I think, in the way it's exposed science, how people get to understand it, and how it's also exposed a lot in churches or something like that by some apologists. And I think this is the part where it hurts in a long term, that science becomes kind of an age, because you'll go to a scientist and you say, how can a dog adapt to become a good swimmer? And you can't adapt as a good swimmer, and it's not a dog, but let's say that apart, because this is not the language of the science. The science never says the dog adapts. It is adapted, if you want this term, because the environment changes via plasticity or genetic drift. What do you think the science fails to reach the gap to, let's say, to Christians, but I'm not saying necessarily to Christians, in the way it's expressed, if you understand? Because I see this gap between the science talk in scientific papers versus...
Well, I would say that that science is complex and it's non-intuitive. That's not just about evolution. That's just true about all areas of science. And so there's usually a gap between public understanding and where things actually stand. And that's okay. But it becomes a problem if it's being exploited to make arguments that don't actually stand up on closer scrutiny. So, and like I say, evolution is complex. I mean, some of the things they're saying, I think, are up for debate in terms of the mechanisms. I think also, they are being debated among scientists. That's not the problem. The bigger issue is whether or not there's reasons for believing that there's strong evidence for intelligent design in evolutionary processes, and I don't think there is strong evidence for it. I don't think science gives evidence for or against it, and I think there's space for it, but I don't think that the ID arguments end up working in that sense. I don't think the atheist arguments that are sometimes made.
I agree. I personally think that evolution is agnostic about God.
Yeah. So the question about it, though, is like, now when there's a lack of understanding about that, though, then yeah. So people who want to make the point, rhetorically or in the public, swear, they can capitalize on the misunderstanding, and that's a problem. I think that's what really frustrates a lot of scientists, and I mean, and it should frustrate them both ways, not just about ID, but also about people, trying to, promote any sort of view by misrepresenting science, even if it's a preferred view.
Mm-hmm. I agree. And I would say one more thing about ID. Have you heard about the challenge? I think it was done by an atheist researcher, but it was asking intelligent, Discovery Institute to discover. Have you heard about this challenge?
What's the question?
Yeah, so the challenge was that one researcher said, say to me one gene or one sequence that it is designed. So to see it has no similitude with all the other genes. So this was around 15 years ago, the challenge, if I recall right. It was right after the Dover trial. So maybe 12, 13. And this researcher said, look, we have already kind of 3-4 sequences. Right now we have around 200, if I remember right. Show to me one gene which was designed. Do you think scientists can find it? This kind of gene that it was not
Well, I mean, that's kind of a poorly specified question. I mean,
but the design is poorly specified. So that was the.
I mean, so they have proposed sequences, but they're not really clear about what they mean by design either in those cases. So, I mean, yeah, I don't know what to make of that. I mean, it's kind of, and if I was posed that challenge, I would say, well, you know, I think they were all designed. But
Okay.
I'm not saying that you can show that by science. I mean, I know that because God created all things, and in that sense, He designed everything. And some of that design would have been through evolutionary processes. So, showing me that it evolved by natural processes isn't telling me it's not designed, is what I would say. Now, that's not what they're trying to say, but
right.
That would be my response. And from a theological point of view, I don't think there's any problem with what I just said. You know, there just isn't. So what I think what they mean is something beyond natural processes alone.
Right. So what
But they're not specific about what that would be. So it becomes very
right. So the challenge was quite specific, if I remember right, that you had to prove that I don't know exact wording. I'm not a scientist. It was that you should prove that more than 90% of the sequence, it can't become through a simple mutation, something like that. It's like, you understand. It was quite specific, the challenge, and he was a geneticist. And I can look for the challenge later, but the point was that he thought that there is no gene, and we will not find any gene to be without a designer. You understand? Just injected into the sequences. Yeah, you understand? Let's say,
yeah, I mean, that's a particular mechanism, but you know,
right?
All you could do is disprove that mechanism, and so fine, you've disproven that mechanism.
Right, I agree. So that's let's go also right now. Let's go more to also where we wanted to go, to your book, and so we established that you are a Christian. We established that you are a conservative, more or less, and you accept the Bible as it is. I want you first of all to say you a small challenge, and this is specific partially for Romanian culture, and I hope I will transpose it correctly. So, have you heard about this story about the bear and the fox and how the bear remained without a tail?
No.
No. So I'll say you a Romanian story which you never heard it before.
Yeah.
Okay. And so the bear and the fox, obviously they can speak to each other. Let's not go into details if they can't speak. So the winter is coming. Both the bear and the fox are hungry, and the fox says to the bear, "Look, I ate a lot of fish yesterday night. Would you want yourself to eat?" And the bear says, "Yes, I'm starving. Winter is hard. Look what I did." So you see this lake. It has this ice on top. It has a layer of ice on top. Break a hole, put your tail inside it, and right away the fish will grab your tail, and you take the tail out. But if you don't see them yet, you just wait. And what happens? The bear does what the fox teaches, and the
tail falls off.
Yes, the hole fills up with ice because it's cold, and the bear is in pain. And he said, the fox says, "Look, you have a lot of fish now. Drag it." And the bear loses his tail. So this is the fairy tale, or whatever you name it, how the bear lost their tails. Don't talk to me. Genetically, it's impossible. The science will have tails. This is the story, okay? I personally see, and I'm not myself inventing it, that Genesis is very close in a view, basically being some stories which explain the human condition. So I'm seeing them purely mythological.
Well, so they're both origin stories in the sense that they're both stories that are supposed to explain the current state of affairs.
Yes.
But
they don't pretend to be scientifically accurate and so on.
Well, they don't pretend to be scientifically accurate because there isn't a concept of science at that time. But Genesis does seem to be claiming to actually be making statements about the physical world and that are taken more seriously. So that's a difference too. So they're both origin stories, and I think everyone would agree with that. And that is a commonality. But I think it's harder to come away saying that it's a fairy tale in the same way as that. It's not clear to me if anyone ever really believed the story about, I mean, except for a child, it's unclear if anyone really ever believed the story about the bear and the fox. But a lot of people think that there was a historical reality to at least parts of the Genesis narrative. And, you know, the fact that it's connected to genealogies, that's different too. That's not a common feature of things that are just merely fairy tales.
Right, but to me, at least, this is maybe my naive reading of Genesis. But Genesis 1, if you read it in the simplest way, I can go to some issues. But it says that the whole universe is made for humans, and they are at the end of the creation. In Genesis 2, excluding the, it says the man is alone. God will also offer to him a proper wife, like a companion.
In Genesis, but I don't think it mentions the universe there in Genesis. I mean, what's really clear is that it's entering in media res, in the middle of things. That's like Latin. It means in the middle of things. Is that there's a lot of other things that were going on. It's not talking about the creation of everything. It's just talking about one thing that God did, and there were other things that He did. There was people. I mean, there's a lot of other stuff going on. So I don't. I mean, this is one story. It's our story, but it's not every story that ever happened. So I don't think it's telling us that the universe is created just for us.
Yes, I'm saying this is a naive reading, or at least I said. I could go.
So look, I mean, I think the reality is that we all have different cultures, right, Cyprian? I mean, you know that you're in the United States, but we're actually both from, you know, a particular time period, right?
I agree. Yes.
And even though English may not be your first language, we're both also kind of influenced by English culture, right? We sit at a particular time point. And we have to be careful about how we read scripture, that we're not unintentionally reading our culture into what it actually says. And one way to actually get help with that is by looking at historical interpretations and how people from very different points of view, even different religions, and even, you know, and certainly different time periods, and really read Genesis and what they saw to be as the plain reading. And often we find out their plain readings were very, very different than ours. And that can give us a lot of insight into what these texts are actually saying, what actually speaks beyond a particular culture, and what actually is maybe closer to the original intent as well. Because I mean, ultimately, that's what we have to get at, is what the original intent was. Now, most people who read Genesis through history, including non-Christians too, to be clear, when they read it, it just seemed not to be a story like the story about, you know, the bear and the fox. They read it more like a story about, a real person and a real past. I mean, more like a story like Abraham, being called, or more like a story like.
Yes, I personally agree. Yes, I think there are some non-literal interpretations. If you heard about Midrash or something like that.
Yeah, but they would always called. So Midrash is an important comparison, right? So they would. So the whole point of Midrash is you affirm multiple layers of it.
Right.
And so say that there is a figurative layer. There certainly is a figurative layer to Genesis, but that doesn't work to deny a historical layer.
Right. If we agree or disagree, that's fine. This is not the point of the discussion.
Well, it's not about what's the right reading here. I mean, so maybe I'm not even talking about my personal view. I'm just talking about, from an evidential point of view, how other people have read it and what these things are. So
I agree. The part which I want to go is your thesis of the book, just to not.
So because of that, so a lot of people, because they've read Genesis not as Aesop's fables, but actually as playing out in the same physical world that we all inhabit, right? It's like a real thing that happened in the past. It really explains things about how things got to be this way, right? That's why that's been the challenging point. I mean, that's where the problems are theologically for a lot of people when it comes to reading scripture and a whole ton of stuff. And what I found out actually is that you can read Genesis. Look, there's a debate about whether or not we should read it literally, but let's just say that we do. Okay, we can read Genesis literally, and it ends up entirely consistent with Genesis. I'm sorry, with evolutionary science. Adam and Eve could have been specially created without parents, like de novo, miraculously created, intelligent design, if you want, as recently as just 6,000 years ago. And they would have become ancestors of everyone before Jesus walks the earth, before Paul writes Romans and speaks on the Areopagus. And so
I agree. I noticed one part scientifically. I read 2 papers on it, and it was saying, I'm misquoting the paper, but because especially in the latest, let's say in the last 2,000 years, we had the roads, for example, and better boats and so on. In 2,000 years, it's possible that even, let's not say Jesus, but Joseph had children. It's possible that Joseph was also the parent of all humans.
It's perhaps even likely that all of us descend from a few people, at least, that were at the Sermon on the Mount hearing from Jesus.
Right. Yes. I think the single rule is you have to have children, basically. It's kind of, if you have 1 child or 2, it's statistically possible that kind of everyone in few thousand years, or 2, 3.
That's surprising. It just turns out we're a lot more connected than we thought, that we're not as separated as
I would say. Also, I read on the same article, but it says that technically this will be true kind of for 99% of the population, but there will be still exceptions. And I would say 2 exceptions. Basically, the Aborigines or something like that, they were not intermixing for many thousands of years. So probably, I don't know, maybe you want to comment. And there were also some islands. We know of this missionary who died on the side of India, and these populations are also isolated by a few thousands of years.
Well, so that's
anyway. Yes, but I won't say that the thesis is for 99.99%. It will be still true, your thesis.
But let's look at those cases. So we know a lot more. So I mean, like the Rhodes paper, when you're reading that stuff, came out in 2004. A lot has changed since then in the last 15 years. Now we know that, so we're talking about like the Senegal Islands with John Chow, who's like the missionary there. So I actually discuss this in my book, and I cite the papers that show that those people aren't actually fully isolated. We can actually see clear evidence of them mixing with their neighbors. So, and in fact, part of the reason why they're so opposed to foreigners is because they were recently colonized by the British. And so,
yes, when you say it's called the British, I understand. Really.
So it's not like they were as isolated. I mean, they are very isolated right now. They have a right to be isolated, but that doesn't mean that there was never, an adopted person over the last several,
I agree, but I heard this argument.
I was going to say thousands of years, but honestly, we're talking about generations. And they're also interbreeding with the local populations in that area, including tribes that are less isolated than them. So then
I agree. I just agree
that's one example. And another example, which I deal with, is Aborigines. And so it turns out that we have very clear genetic evidence that about 4,000 years ago, Indians came on boats to Australia and interbred with them, and that might even be where the dingoes of Australia came from. Like that was like 4,000 years ago.
So you prepared. I didn't read this commentary. I didn't read your book, sadly. I said so.
Oh yeah. So I mean, it turns out, so what I would say is that, look, it's possible that all that was true, and that's what people thought. And so they're saying, well, these are the ones we don't know about. But it just turns out that in every case but one, we've found, pretty strong evidence for, intermixing. Now,
I agree. So that thesis, I said, as I read the paper, it was this, I think it's named the bucket of water, the analogy, like you basically.
Yeah, exactly. So the one place where there's still debate, it's not the Americas, it's not the Senegal Islands, it's not Australia.
Hawaii.
It's really Tasmania, the Tasmanian Islands. So, there is also a debate about, like, I would say like Easter Island in Hawaii, but that's not relevant for the time period that we're talking about because they're not inhabited, 2,000 years ago, right? They're inhabited later. But if we're talking about today, maybe they were isolated. That's harder to figure out.
I personally think it will not change in any way the thesis. So if you get let's say 99% of the population, it is true, the story, really. I'm not.
And also for Tasmania, if we're talking about today,
today
it's a horrible story. Let's say they were really isolated, when they were colonized. you know, it's horrific what was done to them by, you know, the British. But, you know, they're certainly mixed right now is the thing. I mean, maybe it was different in the past, but right now they are mixed by no choice of their own. I mean, that was a pretty horrible situation that happened. But so we're not even really talking about people alive today.
I agree. So as I said to you, to me, it will not break the argument, even if there will be, as I said to you, 1% at most of people, because you understand, exception in a way strengthen the rule. No joke. Yeah. So, but just to say, this is the single kind of criticism as I did from outside. Other part which I liked about the book is, first of all, that you really go scientifically, in the sense that you say, let's try the model and see how well it stands under scrutiny. So, do you think?
I tried to falsify it. So this is a little bit different than making a case for it, right? So, like, I considered all of the biggest objections. So, like, I mean, like the ones you're raising, for example, aren't things that I ignored and passed over. I dealt with them head on.
Awesome. I sorry, I read that the commentaries on your book, not, and if I missed, even if this criticism was, this is the single one I could see it as for myself, from as an outsider. What do you think that, let's say we have two people, de novo, Adam and Eve in Garden of Eden. Do you think that it will fulfill all the other parts? For example, the flood. Maybe I know you don't touch into the book.
Yeah, but if you read Genesis literally, for example, not in English but in Hebrew, it says that the entire Eretz was flooded. It doesn't say the whole planet was flooded. It says the entire Eretz was flooded. So then the next question should be, well, where was the Eretz? What is the Eretz? And it's not the planet. I mean, there's clearly described places that are beyond the Eretz. And so it's just talking about in that area. And there's really nothing in conflict with science to say there's a large regional flood.
Right. So
in fact, there's evidence for large regional floods there too. So, and I'm not talking about the Black Sea. I mean, you can even just look at the Persian
I
Gulf.
heard this Black Sea hypothesis.
Yeah, it's not even. I don't even think that's correct. I mean, I think you could take it right there. I mean, I think the most likely thing is the Persian Gulf oasis. So, like the Persian Gulf used to be dry land until very recently, and then
I know. So I'm on the same field. I wanted to read. I was really curious if you go, if only Adam and Eve, or you go all the others. Like, and I'm not saying you don't take it literally. You take it literally, but to which extent? And I personally think it was a local flood, and this is also what.
Yeah, and so it just makes sense to understand it that way. So, like I said, can you take it literally? Yeah, of course you can take the flood literally, just not with a naive English translation. But
right.
But who would do that in the first place? I mean, someone.
People said
like, that's not justifiable or sustainable. So I mean, let's not do that. Let's actually read it for what it says.
I agree. What do you think that you said, which I agree on as a thesis, like Adam and Eve, what, let's say, if they were mixed to 6,000 years ago, I said to you, for me, even 2,000 years ago, it would be realistic. All the humanity would be more or less from two parents, a very diluted gene. What do you think about the thesis, like humanity come through them? What happens, let's say, 500 years after Adam and Eve for the mixed, to use the
so the point that we didn't mention before is, how do you make sense of this with evolution? Well, there was people outside the garden that got excited in other ways, revolutionary processes, right, that are mixing, and that's great. So then the question is, well, how do we think about those other people? Well, scientifically, they're just like us. They're Homo sapiens. They have minds. There's really not a distinguishing feature. There may be behaviorally is. I mean, we can make debates about that. There's some interesting stuff in science around that, about the rise of civilization and such, but let's just leave that aside. I mean, biologically, they're the same. And so that's how you think about them. So then how do you think about them theologically? Well, theologically, we know that, you know, with many traditions, that there's something theologically distinct about Adam and Eve's lineage, and Scripture seems to be bound to their lineage. So Scripture doesn't tell us a lot then about the people that are not in their lineage. So we have to start making guesses and inferences and speculation.
Yes. Right. I think the William Lane Craig thesis would solve this theological point, and that's why I want to say.
But I don't think it does, actually. I think it creates more problems.
Right, so please comment. So the idea is that, for example, Jesus died for our sins. Would they die for the people which are outside of the mixing population? This, I thought it was his sticking point.
Yeah, but I think that's actually fairly easily resolved. There's a really good paper written by a respondent of my book that just came up on Peaceful Science called by Ken Keithley. So I encourage you to take a look at that. It's called Antipodes and the Scandal of Particularity. but people have been wondering about these sorts of questions too, like even about how do we think about, you know, Gentiles before Jesus came? Like, did Jesus die for them? Are any of them going to heaven or not? Those are the sorts of questions people ask. And there's actually, the Christian religion really has deeply embedded in it is a notion of eras or dispensations, and that God operates in different ways. And so the reason why is, I mean, you have to, because Jesus comes and he changes everything. There's this church and includes the Gentiles and all that. But before that, you know, you have like the Jewish state, and there's also God-fearers, like people who are actually connected to the true God, but weren't part of Israel. So how do you make sense of that? And so people would say, well, there's different dispensations of grace. God's working in different ways in different times to make himself known to people. And so all this means is there's another dispensation that was there before Adam. A different way that God was making himself known to people. That's one solution. The other solution is just to say that, you know, that was before the covenantal opportunity was offered. And so those people...
Yes, to me, I would say more as a fan of science than as a fan of theology, just to say, your thesis, to me, it looks closer, because to me, it looks like trying to explain why the fox has tail and the bears have not. It's like, and I'm not talking only about mythology of the Genesis. Even he thinks it's a myth of history, which we'll take it aside.
Yeah, well, the thing about it is like the fox and the bear thing. The problem is that we know that that's not actually how a bear got a smaller tail, right?
Right. But the part which I want to say,
it doesn't actually. So it's not to teach us that a bear has a smaller tail, because we already know that it has a smaller tail.
We know, yes.
Teach us why, and we know therefore the teaching of it is actually incorrect, and so that's why it's a problem for a lot of theologians to go down that path of Genesis. So yeah, we're all sinners.
To me, the issue it was that if you heard about these things. So around 75,000 years ago, it was this Toba, I think, let's say extinction, maybe not. So we know there was a genetic bottleneck of people, because, and this part is probably when the last, I may be wrong, Homo erectus was killed. So there were some events, and I think you can't make a good sense of all these things said, even by stretching generations, which William Lane Craig tries to do it. Just to say, if you take it, you can't play both sides. You say it's a myth, you understand, but this part is literal, because you can't make genealogies right. In my side.
Well, yeah, I mean, I do think that there's questions arising about it, but there might be better cases than Bill Craig makes. I mean, so Jack Collins is trying to. I mean, I'm not terribly convinced, but I think it's a lot of work to foreclose like a mystery that's pretty clearly there in Genesis about what about the people outside the garden, and they're trying to foreclose that mystery and say, well, they didn't exist, or they didn't exist as fully human people, and that's one way to answer the question. I just think that that's not what we're really required to do, or what Scripture demands, or the most simple solution. So, but I mean, of course, they think that working out a way how to make sense of people outside the garden that are like fully human is really complex. So I mean, that's kind of where the debate's getting to be kind of fun and interesting.
I personally say other problem, which I heard it from Rabbi Wolpe. He's a very known Jewish rabbi. And he said that one other issue which you have, if you don't get people outside of the garden, is that if you have too many people which are close, you always get to incest. which
yeah,
is also
they've already swallowed that pill. They think that it was incest, and I'm like, well, like, okay, so you think this is like a positive thing? But whatever. I mean, I'm a scientist, and I will judge it based on the science. I'll say, yeah, actually, that could work scientifically with several qualifications, and that's where I actually helped the book Craig a great deal. I mean, I don't think science should be illegitimately used against that view. Now, I think it's a pretty dramatic change from how most people have read Genesis over the last 2,000 years. I mean, he's not unique in this. I mean, you can call it maybe like the Catholic view in the sense that it's really risen up as kind of maybe the dominant view among Catholic theologians and philosophers. But I mean, in that sense, it's consistent with some traditions in the church. But I just don't think it's how most people have read Genesis. I think most people have been wondering about people outside the garden. So I just don't see what the problem is.
Right. I said to me there are new issues too, even theological. But maybe I misread the Williams argument. I didn't read his book either, so I'm equal opportunist. One part which I would want to do. Also, I heard very good few things about your book, and I really like you have very clear diagrams, which I know it takes a lot of work to do diagrams. Sometimes it's easy to write all these things. You correct few grammar with I forgot with a spell checker, but at the end, it is also very good that even as basics of what we know about how humans are here, your book describes, and I recommend it even for this. Even as an atheist, I think this is a very good intro. You also talk about racism in science, and things like this, which I really think it's also great to be discussed. So I'm not initially when I was making the invitation, I was recommending to anyone on this discussion to get this book, but as this YouTube clip, it will be on the Peaceful Science Facebook page. We will, everyone who will write there, I want the book. We will, after let's say a week, I don't know, we didn't agree yet. We will give to any person that wants the book to have it in a physical form, and I would make sure it will arrive there.
Oh, well, thanks. That's really kind of you. So if you didn't catch that, send him a note on YouTube or Facebook, and he'll give you a free copy of the book at some point, or at least one or two people who kind of choose between them. So thank you for doing that.
Yes, it's really my pleasure.
Yeah, and and I think in the end here, I think there's an opportunity for a better sort of conversation to arise, like even what we're having right now, where instead of kind of going for the conflict that's often there between creationists and atheists and scientists and all that, maybe we can sit down together and find out how to make space for one another, and how to understand why we think things are important. I mean, a great example of this is you're really convinced that evolution is true. I am too. A lot of Christians are not. They can come to the table and just understand, even if they disagree, why is it that you think evolution is actually true? Likewise, there's a lot of Christians that really think that Genesis needs to be read not as the fox and the bear story, but as something that has more reality to it. And that doesn't make sense to you. I think there's an opportunity to come to sit down at the table and just understand why it's important to them, even if you disagree.
I see it really in the same way. And also, what I really think it's very amazing on the page of Joshua, which I will put it also in this YouTube link description, is that let's repeat, he is conservative, he's a Christian, he's a doctor with relevant sciences, and I'm not using this as a praise. What I was really surprised is also your, I forgot how his name, H-index, how many citations you get out of your papers, which are around 30, which is amazing, really. I mean, there are papers, and I don't want to say that mine has no citations yet, but I wrote one paper. Doesn't matter. This is true. Anyway, my paper was done really as a challenge, because it's the story with my paper, and I will let you kind of wrap it and say your wording at the end and so on. So the paper was done when I'm very interested into kind of how to do very high volume processing of data. And I was used to work in finance, and there you process a lot of data. And there was one Intel researcher saying, you can do it with our 22-core server Xeon 1.5 terabytes of memory. You know, you have this, SAM files or BAM files. You process them. He wanted to process them in memory, and he tried it with multiple languages. And I noticed that one language which I kind of know a lot, he got numbers way off. And I said, this is nonsense. I wrote to this guy, you have to make a correction there. And he said, I'll not make a correction, publish a paper. And I said, I'll publish a paper. And this is what was very instrumental to me, is that I noticed how painful is to your ego, the peer review. Also, I noticed how you can technically challenge, even as an outsider, the science. So when you say the science doesn't accept my paper because I'm a creationist, this is nonsense. I tried it. I criticized, as I said to you.
Well, I mean, okay, let's be fair here.
Right.
Science is actually very inviting, but there is also a bias and prejudice, maybe rightfully so, against ID and creation. Okay.
Right.
That does make it very hard when they have a point.
Yes, but I'm saying you can definitely publish. That's what I wanted to say. And you may not get a citation or something like that, but you kind of can, and you can do it even in top journals, even you're not affiliated with anything, as I wasn't.
Just yeah, that's true. I mean, it's a little complicated. I mean,
yes, I agree. And to me, it took the paper, I wrote it in 1 month, but to publish it, it took me 1 year, just to say clearly. And I'm not saying why it took so long. And I think for you, if you say, I say, Dr. Joshua Swamidass, it will publish in 1 month, probably. Just say, I'm not saying you are privileged, but I won't say that. I know that you can do science.
Well, thanks. I appreciate that. Yeah. I mean, I've been really fortunate to be in a good place at WashU and have a great team and have really enjoyed doing science. It's been fun.
Okay. So maybe you wrap up. I talked a lot. Sorry. So maybe we can wrap up with your views. How was this interview? And
yeah, thanks for having me. It's always great to talk to people in other parts of the world. So thank you for having me from Romania. It's also great to talk to people that aren't in the Christian faith. I mean, I think it's great when there's these sorts of conversations across differences. And so, I really hope that understanding can increase in places like this. So thanks a lot for having me.
It was really my pleasure. Thank you, Joshua. Don't forget for the book. Comment down and see you soon. Okay. Bye-bye.